Salam, Shalom, Peace. I'm Azra Hussain, President of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, also referred to as ISBA or ISBA. Welcome to the first Ilm Circles workshop in 2021. Tonight's topic is titled Christians and the Birth of Jesus. Why do Christians celebrate the birth date of Jesus on different dates? What is the significance of December 25 and January 6th? This will be presented by Pastor Vernon Meyer. Vernon Meyer is the pastor of Sun Lakes United Church of Christ in Sun Lakes. He has a PhD in theology from the University of Dayton, Ohio. He is a member of No Longer Silent Clergy for Justice, which is an organization committed to ending discrimination against LGBT people in religion and society. He's an international traveler, including a recent pilgrimage to the Holy Land and Jordan in October 2019. Welcome, Pastor Meyer.
Thank you. Thank you, Azra. It's so good to be with you this evening. I've been following for many years now the work of the Islamic Speakers Bureau. So it's exciting for me to have the first opportunity to be with you, to share some thoughts and reflections with you, and to welcome to everybody who's joined us tonight. It's kind of interesting that we're at the end of January, and it seems as if Christmas, which was in 2020, was a long time ago, and of course January the 6th also at the beginning of the month. So when we talk about this, it's kind of in hindsight, right? We've already celebrated these days in the world around us. So I just want to share some reflections with you, some insights so that we can have a better understanding of the birth of Jesus, as well as how we ended up on December 25th and January the 6th. But as I begin that, I just want us to kind of think for a moment about our own birth and the stories of our own birth. It's usually our parents, much later in life, if we as children ever ask the question about our own birth, it's usually our parents that tell us about our birth, what happened, who was there, where it happened, when it happened, and so forth. In my family, the story of my birth, I was a premature baby, so I'm told. It's hard to tell that from the way I am now, bald and a little bit fat. So this tiny little baby, I'm told, that even my family members were almost scared to hold me. I'm an only child, so it was the first birth of my parents that they experienced. And I often wonder, in telling the birth stories, how different it is if we tell it from the father's point of view and the mother's point of view. And we'll see that in a little bit when we look at the different Christian scriptures in the Gospel of Matthew, which more or less tells it from Joseph, or the father's point of view, and Luke's Gospel, which tells it from the mother's point of view. And of course, the father's experience of birth is going to be very different from the mother's experience of birth for obvious reasons, right? That the father doesn't experience the pain of birth or the birthing itself, only the mother does. So even if you were to ask the father or the mother, you might come out with different kinds of stories. And oftentimes, as time goes on, right, we tend to forget some of the details of how that all happened in that. Another added part of my story is that apparently I was born in June 1952, and it was one of the hottest days of the year, supposedly, as the story goes. And that's really a part of it, right? When we tell birth stories, I may say frequently this evening, supposedly, or so the story goes, because most of the time, especially when we're dealing with like the birth story of Jesus, well, no one was there. No one had an iPad or taking down notes. No one was there except Mary and Joseph. And perhaps if we follow the Gospel of Matthew, later on the shepherds in Luke's Gospel, or the three wise people from the East. But it's not really sure, as the Christian story unfolds, that anybody really knew how the birth of Jesus came about. So, in a moment, I'll talk more about that. But to that point of our own reflection and our own stories, I did a little research into the birth of Muhammad. How within the Islamic tradition, how is the birth of Muhammad told? And if we use the Western dating, right, his birth is somewhere in the year 570, and I'll comment a little bit later, 570 AD, which is always an interesting way that in the Western world that we date things from the Christian point of view, and we'll again talk more about that in a moment. But some of the scholars, as they tell it, because who among the followers of Muhammad, who would have been there for his birth? Who was he at the point of his birth? Nobody knew. He was just an ordinary child, if you will. His father dies before he's born, so in a sense, he's born an orphan. And you know better than me the story, right? He gets handed around in the family, and the family is there to support it. So there isn't much historical knowledge really of how the conditions. We know where he was born. We know into what family he was born, but there isn't much else that's told. And some of the scholars, as I read through the stories, begin well, how can I put it? Begin to say, well, at his birth, because we're looking from the perspective of already his life and the revelations that he received and his life as the prophet, that they read into his birth his life. And that's really what happens with Jesus, as the Gospels tell it. You read from the end point back to the beginning point. And so that's going to always present an interpretation, if you will, rather than a historical or factual account of how the birth of Jesus came about, or the birth of Muhammad. And some of the scholars say, well, there were these miracles that happened. Great lights were seen, and so forth. It's interesting how there's a little parallel almost between the way the birth of Jesus and the birth of Muhammad comes about. So when we tell birth stories, there is some factual truth to what the story is about. Obviously, they're born, right? They're born of a woman. They're born in a particular geographical location, in a particular historical moment. Those are all things that we know. But since we tell the story much, much, much later, many, many, many years afterwards, we kind of create the story, if you will, not tell lies about it, but we enhance the telling of the story. Like me finding out in my ancestry that there was my great-grandmother on my mother's side was a Kennedy. And when it was important to be known as a Kennedy descendant, I'd like to think that there was some connection. You see, what I've done is all I know is a family name. I don't know anything about the person, but I create the story to enhance it to some degree. And I think that's not only in terms of what I read about the birth of Muhammad, it gets enhanced later in life to make it even more important and more prominent. But that's what we're going to see with the birth of Jesus as well. So what I also did is then I wanted to go to how the Quran talks about the birth of Jesus. So if we could look at the first slide, I've got the text from the Quran to show what, the second slide, to show what the Quran has to say. And so this is from 1922 and so forth. And it's very interesting how the Quran tells the story. Again, one Islamic scholar said, well, it's obviously not put into a historical context. So the Quran, in telling about the birth of Jesus, doesn't provide a context, a historical context. It does provide information Interestingly, in the Quran, there is the story of Mary or Miriam encountering the angel Gabriel, the archangel Gabriel. And so there's an annunciation story where Mary gets told that she is going to give birth to this child. There's also an interesting connection that as the story is told, that she is not married at the time that she conceives, which is how the Christian story tells it, at least as Matthew's gospel tells it. But it's interesting that as she is driven, she goes out of her family, leaves her family because of the shame that it could bring upon her, where not being married and not having a husband and not knowing in a real sense how this conception takes place. How is it that without a man, how she becomes pregnant? That she goes out into the wilderness, and that is a great theme amongst many kinds of birth stories. So it says, she conceived him and withdrew with him to a far off place. And then I'm not quite sure why it sets it up this way. Obviously, within a desert culture, it's going to be in a desert setting. Then the birth pangs drove her to the trunk of a palm tree, and the pain of her birth overcomes her. But the angel tells her not to grieve because God is going to bring water to flow beneath her. And I can only imagine, again, much like here in Arizona, where we've seen the snow and the rain, and many places we get all upset about snow and rain and the amount of snow and rain, and we get excited because water in the desert is so precious and it's such a gift. And here there's a connection between the gift of life, not only in the birth of this child, but the gift of life that comes from the land too. And she's given to eat and drink, and again, that this child speaks to her, which is an interesting take. So this is how the Quran tells this story. And I hope somebody, by the way, Ezra knows, I can go on talking for a long time. So if there's a way to just let me know how we're doing on time, and that I can give like a time clock kind of thing to say where we are, so I don't end up not getting everything I want to say. So anyway, this is what the Quran says. So if we could look at the next slide, the next one. This is how in the Christian scripture, it's interesting that the earliest writing in Christianity are not the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the earliest writing in the Christian tradition is from the Apostle Paul. Paul was a freeborn Jew in the Roman Empire of the first century, and experiences a powerful conversion on his way along the road. A very familiar story in many religious traditions of how people come to a conversion, much like Muhammad in his experience and encounter with the divine. It changes his life. So Paul has his life changed. But the only thing that he says, and his writings come about 30 years after the time of Jesus, that the only thing he says in his writings is that Jesus was born of a woman. So that he doesn't know the birth stories. He doesn't know, seemingly from the letters that he's writing, that he's not telling us where the birth took place. It doesn't even sound like he knows who Jesus's mother and father are. He doesn't give us much information, which is probably the way it was in early Christianity, is that not much information was known about the birth of Jesus. Because in the Christian tradition, the birth of Jesus was not as important as in the Christian understanding, his death and resurrection. That was the key moment. That's the key moment in Christianity. That's the most important moment in the life of Jesus, and the most important moment in the life of Christianity. It's what the faith rests upon is death and resurrection. And of course, more could be said about that. So, in the tradition, the first focus point was not a birth story, but the death story, the death and resurrection story. And as I said just a little while ago, that then the tradition begins to read from the end point, the death and resurrection, backwards, because the question becomes in the first 30 to 40 years after Jesus, the question, like anything, right? Well, who is this man? Where did he come from? Who's his family? And so they have to find out the information if they can. They have to go to the sources. And there's all likelihood that by the time the next generation comes along, where the Gospels come to be written, is that there aren't too many people from that generation, from the actual time period of Jesus's birth. And so, what do if nobody's around to tell us? In my family, I remember visiting a great aunt and reconnected with some of our family story. And about a month later, in the mail comes this picture of some of my great grandparents, and it's a wonderful picture from probably from the early 1900s or late 1890s. My grandmother knew all the people in the picture, but we never thought of asking her to name the people so we could write on the back of the picture who they were. And to this day, I don't know anybody in the picture because once the generation passes and nobody took the time to give the exact information or to locate it historically, then we don't have it. And perhaps by the time the Gospel of Matthew and Luke come along, that where the resources or the sources for the story are very, very slim. If you're asking, you know in your own family, right? That if you have a 90-year-old grandfather, great-grandfather, and you say, Grandpa, what was it like back there in 1900? And maybe Grandpa doesn't know, or Grandpa has just a sketchy remembrance of it, or maybe has lost it altogether. So by the time that the next generation of the Christian community comes along, they're asking very serious and important questions. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? We've come to believe in him, but we don't know much more about him. And some of that comes out of the fact that Christianity is growing up in a very secular pagan society of the Roman Empire, where birth and geographic location becomes important. Who you were mattered in the social ranking of the community. And so if you hold Jesus to be a prophet, to be who Christians believe him to be as the Savior, we need some of that connection to family, to history, and to culture. So it's interesting. I don't have the text here, but immediately before this text in the Gospel of Matthew is this long genealogy where Matthew, the writer of Matthew's Gospel, takes great pains to chronicle every generation. And much like, it's interesting, right? In the story of Islam and Muhammad, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and it goes down through the generations, much like you might have the genealogy down through Ishmael, down to the present time. And so Matthew, and an important thing to note about Matthew is Christian scholarship locates the Gospel of Matthew in a Jewish Christian community. So how do you tell the story with that eye towards the audience that you're telling the story to, with the idea that they are now being asked to follow someone and to believe something that almost contradicts what they had believed before and is very different from what they had believed before? I think of the struggle, right, within Muhammad's own life to get the people of Mecca to believe what he was saying about the revelations that he was receiving from God. People didn't believe him. He's just the boy down the street. Who is this guy they're telling us this? And so the same struggle within early Christianity. How do we accept the truth of the story when we're just uncertain about the origins of the story? So I wanted you to see what the text in Matthew's gospel says about the birth of Jesus, and I'll just do some explaining of it. Now, this is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All this took place, and then here's the interpretation that the gospel writer adds, that we've got to situate this story in the larger Jewish Hebrew scripture tradition, right? All this is to fulfill what the prophet had said. Now, let me caution you, because this quote comes from Isaiah. I put it in there, Isaiah 7:14. The original reference in Isaiah is not about Jesus at all. It's about someone in Isaiah's own time when the Babylonians were encamped outside the walls of Jerusalem, and they were looking for some solution to this siege that they were experiencing. And so for Isaiah in the 7th century, 6th century before the Common Era, it's about Isaiah's time. But it shows that in telling the story, Christians take a more ancient text and apply it or interpret it as having something to do with the birth of Jesus. And in many religious traditions, this is what happens, how we do this, how we fill in the gaps in the story, if you will. So for this, then Joseph awoke from sleep. He did as the angel of the Lord commanded and took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. And that's all that's said in the Gospel of Matthew about the birth of Jesus. Notice it's put into the context of a dream, and this is a very powerful religious tradition, not just in Christianity, but in Judaism, and I'm sure there's stories similar in Islam, where people go into this dream-like trance, if you will, or a deep spiritual moment, and you hear things and you see things and you understand things in a powerfully different way than if it was, right physically right before you. And so it's true here that in a dream, Joseph hears and sees the way to resolve this strange dilemma that he's in, because it is just like in the Quran and the birth of Jesus in the Quran, that this is a shameful thing. How is it that this young girl, only engaged, becomes pregnant? I mean, in our own time, this is always a very disturbing experience for families where a young daughter becomes pregnant, and lots of questions surround it. So in a way, the text is relating a relatable experience, not one that's very pleasant for people, but one that still stands in a powerful testimony. The birth of Jesus, as it's being told in the Christian tradition, isn't a neat, clean, conflict-free moment. It's filled with conflict. It's filled with danger. It's filled with uneasiness. It's filled with pain and suffering. You can imagine Joseph is experiencing much pain and suffering of this. He's going to be shamed by this too. He wants to put her away quietly, wants to send her off. And how many families tell that story where in the past, they would send their daughters away so they would give birth away from the view of the community, much like the Quran says. Mary goes out to the desert where she doesn't have to endure the eyes of her family and community around the same kind of thing. Here, it takes place in a very private space for Joseph and for Mary. But notice there's not much detail about the birth itself. Again, perhaps because, you know, 40, 50 years after the event itself, 40 or 50 years after the event, people maybe aren't interested in the exact detail of how the birth happened. They just know it happened. And that's maybe all that needs to be said as far as Matthew's gospel tells it. So that's how one scripture, and I should say that Matthew and Luke's gospel that we're going to look at next actually come from another generation. So we have Paul as the earliest testimony, around 50 of the Common Era. Mark's gospel that I didn't mention, Mark's gospel comes from about 67 of the Common Era, so about 10 to 15 more years after Paul. Mark's gospel has no birth story at all. There's no, what we would say, infancy story. There's no birth story at all. Jesus appears on the scene and comes to John the Baptist. So there's no birth story in Mark, which is always interesting. Maybe did Mark not know about the birth of Jesus? Obviously not, because later in Mark's telling of the story of Jesus, he knows that Jesus comes from Nazareth, and he knows that Jesus was born of Mary because his mother is mentioned. But that's it. So that the next generation, Matthew and Luke, coming another 10 years or 20 years after Mark, and now we're about 75 of the Common Era. So Paul 50, Mark 67, 65, Luke and Matthew 75 to 80. So we're almost 40 years now after the time of Jesus' death and resurrection. So I want you to take a look at this. This is how the story is told in the Gospel of Luke. Now, what Christian scholars say about Luke is written to a more Gentile audience. Matthew is told to a more Jewish audience. And so that's probably why it's told about Joseph. What was women's testimony within in that traditional Middle Eastern culture? Women's testimony didn't have much value at all. And so within that tradition, especially within a more traditional Jewish community, the woman's testimony isn't going to be valued highly. So it's told from Joseph's point of view to make it more acceptable, more palatable, more recognizable within that community. Remember, when I started, I said, so how does the father? Notice the father isn't going to tell us about the birth itself. It just, fact. Oh, he was born. Nothing more. I mean, maybe because he didn't pay attention, wasn't there, who knows what it is. We'll see this in a moment. So here's Luke's story, and what Christian scholars say about Luke's story is that it's written to a Gentile community, meaning that it's not a Jewish community per se, more Gentile, meaning these are people who have come to Christianity not through Judaism, but come to Christianity through the Roman world of the first century. And it's also the finest Greek in the New Testament, meaning that scholars believe that it's written to a prosperous, educated community, very different from Matthew's community. And so its focus and its way that it tells the story is geared towards that audience. And I think that's an important thing that I'm trying to suggest, that when we talk about birth stories, right, even in our own family telling of the stories, who we're telling it to may shift some of the language and some of the coloring of it because of the person we're telling it to, or to a family member, more intimate family member, or to a non-family member, how we're going to tell it. It's, again, not creating a false story. It's just how how we tell stories. And you can imagine, again, in the Middle East, in telling stories around the campfire at night or around, the dinner table in a more prosperous home, that you're going to create the story because you don't have the same kind of visuals that we have today. So you have to create the story. You have to add the drama to the story. You have to add the color to the story, and that's the power of the storyteller itself. And that's what I saw in reading about the birth of Muhammad. There's a power in the story telling that creates the aura around the individual you're telling about, that enhances the person, if you will. So this is how Luke tells it, and I'll explain the things afterwards. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration. It was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now let me just stop there for a moment. You can see already there's a difference that Luke is situating the birth of Jesus in a historical moment, in a geographical location. And by the way, it's interesting, right, that we know that Caesar Augustus is emperor in Rome roughly from about 63 before the Common Era to about 14 of the Common Era, before the Common Era, after the Common Era. And that's just a way to move away from talking about, AD and BC, which are Christian designations. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. So we know that here Luke is telling us that the birth of Jesus is happening somewhere during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. But that's also a political context, right? Jesus' birth doesn't just happen in a apolitical world. It's happening when the Emperor Augustus is ruling. And we know that the later part of his reign is called the Pax Romana, that Rome had occupied all of the territories around the Mediterranean, and that the world was defined now by Rome, and especially by the emperor. And so Luke is going to say, whoa, wait a minute, that's not, what's the difference here between the Emperor Augustus, who, by the way, had a miraculous birth story being told about him, and Jesus having this miraculous birth story being told about him. Quirinius is governor in Syria, interestingly enough, roughly about 51. He lived about 51 before the Common Era to 21 of the Common Era. So what Luke is saying is Jesus is born sometime then, sometime before 14 in the Common Era and before 21 of the Common Era. And then the story goes on. A town of Nazareth in Galilee, to Judea, which is in the south, Galilee's in the north, Judea's in the south, to a city of David called Bethlehem. It's interesting that what we know historically, Nazareth is a very small village in Galilee, probably in this time not more than maybe 200 or 300 people. And Bethlehem's even smaller. Bethlehem's about 20 miles south of Jerusalem. So you go from the north to the south. And if you read the story, oh my gosh, Mary's very pregnant and she travels from Galilee to Judea. Modern times, probably about 8 or 9 hour drive on the highway, maybe a 2 or 3 day journey on a donkey. Can you imagine that, riding, very pregnant lady riding on a donkey across very rough roads, dirt roads? It's not a very pleasant experience. And there's more that could be said about that could be said at another time. There seems to be a census, and there's lots of disagreement as to whether this actually took place. When Quirinius becomes governor, in order to impress the Emperor Augustus, he calls for a census. And you all know, right? We just went through a census in 2020. The purpose of the census is for taxation. So already another layer is added to this, that it's taking place under very difficult conditions for the Jews living in first century Palestine, living in Judea or Galilee under Roman occupation. That's a whole nother layer to the story. Again, Luke picks up that this is Mary who's expecting a child and she's only engaged. And then it says, she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. If you remember, I said that the story, the birth story, is told through the death story. And so if you look at this, how it could be interpreted, firstborn son could mean there are other children, which is an interesting idea to relate to Mary. Or it could say, if you translate it right, she gave birth to her son, the firstborn, and firstborn children in the first century were the ones who inherited property, the property of the family. She wraps him in bands of cloth, and you see the swaddling clothes, how in the ancient tradition in Palestine probably, to keep the baby warm, to hold the baby tight, you would wrap it in swaddling clothes or bands of cloth. But the same words in Greek, or the same words where the body of Jesus is wrapped at the end of the story. And laid him in a manger. And I'm sure that you've seen pictures over the Christmas season of various representations of this event, where you see a sawhorse kind of thing with straw in it that's freestanding in the middle of a place, a barn type place, where the animals would be kept. In truth, it was probably a cave with the house on the upper level, and the animals would be kept in the cave below because it was warm in the winter and cool in the summertime. It was probably out of the side of the cave itself where the feeding trough was. So it's interesting that Luke is telling the story for people who never had traveled to Bethlehem, didn't know maybe even where Bethlehem was. So he creates a story for less of the historical context, although he puts it into the historical context. He tells the story less for the historicity of it and more for powerful spiritual and theological reasons, which is how sometimes we do it, right? We tell the birth story not for its history, but more for these powerful moments. This is the Quran tells the birth of Jesus in miraculous ways. If he is going to be a prophet, then we have to see the birth as having prophetic, miraculous, spiritual power to it. So that's the two texts. There are no other texts that we have of the birth story of Jesus. Any kinds of, if there are any questions, don't hesitate to ask, or any kinds of clarification, you can send them to us so that I can, how's everybody doing with this? Okay? Are we doing okay? Okay? Okay.
No
Now,
question so far.
okay. Now the point of how the title of this was, well, how do we get to December 25th, and how do we get to January the 6th? There is no indication in these texts that we've looked at, no indication so far that the writers are locating this on any particular day of the week, on any particular date in a month, on any particular year, that it's just taking place. Luke situates it in the reign of the Emperor Augustus and Quirinius, but there's like a 10-year time frame for that. So it's interesting that in Western Christianity, much like I think, and I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, that within the Islamic tradition, the calendar that gets used in a way is contrary to the Western dating of time according to the birth of Jesus, where the Islamic calendar is from that flight of Muhammad, so the Hijra. So, that's year one, And so the Islamic calendar dates its history according to that year one being there. Well, when the no historical documents, there was no birth certificate for Jesus, that later Christianity, probably after the time of Constantine, decides that the birth of Jesus is going to be year one. Why? Because in Christianity, in its view of itself in the world, it should be dated according to the birth of Jesus. But what we find out is that we know from the text again that Herod the Great was the ruler of Judea at this time. Herod the Great was a client king of Rome. He was a buddy of the Emperor Augustus, and so was allowed to rule in Judea for this. It was according to that that Herod the Great was ruler. But what we know about Herod the Great is that he dies in 4 before the Common Era, the Common Era. So if Jesus is born during the time of Herod, then he has to be born before the Common Era, which now we scholars are suggesting that he's born in about 4 before the Common Era. So by the Western calendar dating the birth of Jesus to year 0, he's already 4 years old by that time. So let's see, the question comes up, what strong conflicting tenders were thrown out? There really were no others. None of the other Christian scriptures that get discovered many years later, none of them had birth stories in them. It's only seemingly the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke that has the birth stories. There are many other Christian scriptures, but none of them have the birth story. It all starts when Jesus appears on the scene, and that he appears on the scene, and so his public life becomes the beginning of his story. And that's it. Again, 30, 40, 50 years later, they're asking, they want to know whose family, where did he come from? Then we begin to search for the birth stories, all right? And right, as the Gospel of Matthew has told the story, that Herod, if you know the history of Herod the Great, he was an awful character. He built these lavish palaces all over Palestine, did an incredible job of building what would become Caesarea Maritima, the great port of the Roman Empire on the Mediterranean, so that Herod is a despicable character. And the question comes up, you're right, in Matthew's Gospel, there is the slaughter of the children, because he perceives the birth of Jesus as a threat to his power, a threat to his authority, and so forth. That's how Matthew's Gospel tells it, which in Matthew's tradition, that's why Mary, Joseph, and Jesus has to flee to Egypt, to leave this violent place of Judea and flee till Herod dies. So that's a part of it. So anyway, if in the tradition Jesus is born about 4 before the Common Era, where does this tradition then move to? So now we're past the time of the Gospels being written. We're into the 100s and 200s, so into the 2nd and 3rd century of the Common Era. Again, I should have suggested that in the Roman times, you dated things by the reign of the emperor, so that it would be like in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, so that you would say, and historically we know what year that would be now, using Western calendars. We know what year that would be, but that's how you would know it. You wouldn't know it as 23 or 1980 or 2021. You wouldn't know it as that. You just say, like now, in the first week of the President Biden. That's how you would say it. And in 4 years, in the fourth year of the administration of President Biden. That might be how you would say it today. You'd have to know when he was president in order to locate it on the calendar, let's say. So by the first century, again, there's not too much interest in situating the birth of Jesus on a given day or a given time frame. It's always interesting that if you read Luke's gospel, that the first ones to recognize Jesus, to come to the birthplace of Jesus, are shepherds. And it says in Luke that shepherds were out in the fields watching over their flocks, and they have this vision of the angels coming and telling them that something special has happened, and so they are to go to Bethlehem and see this special event. Well, when I've been to the Middle East, in that culture, even not so much anymore, where the Bedouins still stay with their flocks out in the desert, that they would not have been out in the field in the middle of winter. Jerusalem is about 4,000 feet altitude, and so it gets cold. It gets snow in Bethlehem and Jerusalem in the wintertime. It gets very cold there. So you could not imagine that if December the 25th is the date for Jesus' birth, according to Western tradition, why there would be shepherds in the field. It just does not make sense. So some suggest that the birth probably didn't take place in December, but sometime in the spring or in the summer, maybe during lambing season in the spring. So you already have some conflict with the way that the story gets told and the way that the tradition is developing around the birth story of Jesus. How is this possible that we would have shepherds in the field in the middle of winter? No, it would not have happened that way. So there's already a question for us to think about in terms of the birth of Jesus. So it's not until the 3rd century, sometime around 273 of the Common Era, that the first mention of December the 25th comes along. So we're 300 years almost from the time of the birth of Jesus. And now we're getting a date set, December the 25th. Why that date? Well, lots of scholarship have lots of time, midnight oil and so forth has gone into trying to figure this out, why December the 25th. There are some stream of scholarship that argues it this way. So if the birth of Jesus takes place in the context of the Roman Empire, and we're approaching now in the 3rd century a growing Christian community in the Roman Empire, and this struggle for power, if you will, the struggle to control the truth, the media, whatever it might be, that the conflict comes that Rome still, the pagan Roman Empire, wants to keep its festivals going strong, so that the birth date of the emperor is a critically important celebration that every Roman city in the empire would celebrate, because not to celebrate the birth date of the emperor would bring scorn upon it. You want to celebrate the great festival days of the gods and goddesses, like the god Zeus, and on down the list of Roman gods and goddesses. This is how it had been done in the ancient Greek world, that the gods and goddesses had their days that they would be celebrated as the cycle would go along. And probably they were using a lunar cycle, maybe. And there is a difference, right? Islamic calendar goes by way of a lunar calendar. So does Jewish calendar goes by way of a lunar calendar. But the Roman calendar was a solar calendar, so that it had its months dedicated to the various gods and goddesses and emperor. It had its particular days within those months. So why don't we just, like on the Wheel of Fortune, spin the dial, and whatever it ends up, that's what we're going to give to the birth date of Jesus? No, because the ascendancy of Christianity in the Roman Empire is going to put it in political conflict with the empire. And so some scholars suggest that the choice of December 25th matches a particular winter festival dedicated to the god Saturn, Saturnalia, and maybe you've heard things about this. And it was a great festival within the Roman Empire. And so for Christians, the choice was, do we still continue to celebrate Roman festival days? Yeah, it's a great time to throw a party, to bring on the food, to invite the family over. It's a great time for the Saturnalia to celebrate. And what do the Romans know? We're not going to tell them that we don't really believe in the gods and goddesses anymore, or we don't really think the emperor has any divine power or authority, because quietly what we begin to do is to celebrate it as the birth of Jesus. So what we do is we put another layer, if you will. Here's the Roman celebration of Saturnalia on December 25th. And so what we do within the Christian community, we now layer that over so that when we gather, Christians gather, instead of celebrating the festival of Saturn, we're now celebrating the festival of Jesus. And so by the 3rd century, Christians can go, hey, it's time to celebrate the birth of Jesus. And the Romans just don't get it, that's what we're doing. Although it's clear in the 3rd century, in the 200s and into the early 300s, Christians were severely persecuted by the Romans because of that political threat, because of the growing power that Christianity had within the Roman Empire. It's also, let me just throw this in, it's interesting that the Christians were not persecuted per se because they didn't believe the emperor was divine, but because they refused to be inducted into the Roman army. That the persecution comes when you upset the apple cart of authority and you say, no, we don't believe in war, we don't believe in killing anyone according to the commands of God, and so we're not going to engage in your army. And that just would throw the emperor and his generals into a tizzy. And so that, I think, really is the major reason why Christians are persecuted, besides also not recognizing the emperor as having divine origin. Because by this time, they're believing that Jesus had divine origin. His birth comes as a miraculous birth, and so it begins to develop in Christianity that way. So the first point in the 3rd century is to overlay the celebration of a pagan festival with the celebration of a Christian festival. Now that's not widely held by all Christian scholars. It's not It's just a mere suggestion. We don't really know about that. And yes, the question is they were influenced in some way by the winter solstice. That's what I'm describing. This Saturnalia was the celebration of the winter solstice in that way. So there's possibly some connection with that. But you also have to think that as time goes on into the next century, that's wow, that's a pretty arrogant thing to do, isn't it? To take a celebration of the empire in which you live and overlay it now with a religious celebration that contradicts that original celebration. And now this designation of December 25th that had been a pagan festival of the winter solstice and Saturnalia now becomes the birth of Jesus. So that in 325, in the 315, 325, when the Emperor Constantine declares Christianity an accepted religion within the Roman Empire, that pretty soon the temples, the Roman temples, are being closed down, converted to churches. It's actually not till about the time of the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century that Christianity becomes the empire. So with Constantine, that all the pagan festivals are turned over, redesignated Christian festivals, so that the empire is now defined by Jesus and by the birth of Jesus. So now you begin to date things according to the birth of Jesus. So given the knowledge that Constantine had in the 4th century, you say Jesus was born in 0, so now we're going to date all of Western culture, all of Western tradition, all of Western history according to the birth of Jesus. So that within several more generations, a few more generations, we begin to designate the time before Christ, after Christ, BC, AD. It's perhaps no wonder within the Islamic tradition that the calendar gets developed the way that it does to counter the narrative that Christianity is the definer of the Western world, if you will. So a new calendar, a new way of dating, according to what's important to us. And of course, if you know how that works within Judaism, it's like 6,000, 5,700 something according to the day of creation. If you consider a Chinese calendar, it's another understanding of how old, where we are in history and time. So every religious tradition, every culture develops its way of telling time and dating itself and giving itself recognition within that. So that's kind of how it develops. The question came about Paul's origin, and as I can read it, it says Mithraism or Mithridates. That was one of the cults of the Roman Empire of the 1st century. It was mostly a male cult, and there's lots of carryovers from the cult of Mithras into similar kinds of things in terms of Christianity. But there is no, he was a Jew, and so he would not have at all given any recognition to the Roman cults prevalent in his day. He would not have all tolerated them at all, and in fact condemns them and condemns the way that some followers of the way of Christianity are falling so quickly back into their old way of living and believing, probably out of expediency for them, right? When you know you could lose your job, lose your family, and die, sometimes it's easier to give up the faith. I think of Think of the story of the 15th century in Spain, right? When Ferdinand and Isabella expel the Islamic community from Spain, they had the choice of forcibly accept conversion to Christianity or flee. Similar kinds of stories in that way. So the suggestion is that Christianity, at least by the 4th century, begins to locate the birth of Jesus on December the 25th. Whether it has that overlay of the winter solstice and Saturnalia is questionable to some extent. There's a lot that it might be too complicated to give you all of the thing that from the scriptures, from the Gospels, that certain dating is given that Mary was in the X month of her pregnancy. And so if that's true and you work backwards from those dates, that you can come to December the 25th, given how long Mary was pregnant, where all of this was taking place. Her cousin Elizabeth, the Luke story tells us that she goes and visits her cousin Elizabeth, who was also pregnant and in her X month of pregnancy, so that you can consider, right, that if the gestation of a baby is 9 months, that you work back from December the 25th, 9 months, and you come to that Annunciation story back in March. 9 months from March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December is the 9th month. So internal questions in the Gospel of Luke, at least, could also, instead of the Saturnalia, winter solstice, is being why Christians set, Western Christians set December 25th, that you could say, well, if we know that the baby grows in Mary's womb 9 months, that you go back from December 25th, Annunciation, then we move forward, we've got December the 25th. So I've been trying to be aware of the fact that this is how the story gets told in Western Christianity. And what I mean by that is that Christianity within the Roman Empire, that if you know history, right, that the Roman Empire, where Jesus grew up in, where these stories take place, is in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And the main language of the eastern part of the Roman Empire was Greek, because that's where the Greek Empire was, the empire of Alexander the Great. So that the language, the vernacular of the people was Greek. When you moved to Rome, the language of the Western Roman Empire, as it begins to develop, Rome and everything west of that, like Spain and France and England and that, the language of the Western Roman Empire was Latin. So that already within Christianity comes the conflict between those who speak Greek and those who speak Latin. And there's, I could go on for another hour telling you about what is created by that divergence of language. It's not quite parallel to what happens in Islam with Shia and Sunni Islam, but a similar conflict that people begin to follow a different tradition. One, because of language, although there's no difference in language there, but how we're going to understand the successors to Muhammad is going to tell us a lot about which tradition we're going to follow. So within Christianity, that until the Bishop of Rome or the Pope begins to claim authority over the whole church, that it was a pretty collegial community, that each bishop had authority for himself, and there was no singular authority except when all the bishops would come together in a council, like they did at the first council in 325. So that Christianity has a language problem between those who speak Greek and those who speak Latin. It comes to a head finally in the 11th century, 1056. And in 1056, the Christians living in the Eastern Roman Empire, which by now had become the Byzantine Empire, so that adds a layer of political intrigue and controversy, were tired of the bishop in Rome, where he was the only authority. In the East, the Byzantine emperor had equal authority to the patriarch or the bishop of Constantinople. In the West, only the pope. And all of the nations that we know now were just beginning to develop, whether in Spain or in France or in England or in Germany or in Italy itself. So the Pope took sole control and began to make decisions for the Christians in the East. But every time that he tried to make a decision for the Christians in the East, they would pass language-wise, and they got all mixed up. That the translations, if you've ever tried moving from one language to another, you know how difficult it is, because you cannot always precisely translate from one language to another. So in 1056, the churches in the East say, that's it, we've had it with you Christians in the West. So they continued to travel down a path that becomes, it's called orthodoxy. They believe they are the only true Christian church, if you will, because they have not changed the original teachings or dogmas. That's the proper word, the teachings. They have not changed any of them since the last council in the 7th century. The West, Christians in the West, under the authority of the Pope, began to change all kinds of things, began to add things into the faith that no council had established and decreed. So now we've got two branches, two communities of Christianity, one speaking Latin, and one still in a more collegial community with bishops in Alexandria in Egypt, in Jerusalem, in Constantinople, in Antioch, and in Jerusalem itself, as I think I said. So there are multiple centers of authority. And that's how we get the split between West and East, between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And of course, as time will go on for Orthodoxy, as the nations in the East begin to develop out of the Byzantine Empire, you move to having the Church of Greece, the Church of